Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I am here with my Best Books of 2017 video. Now these are all books that I have read during this year, not necessarily that were released during this year, so I've got a mix of new releases and backlist books. I did try to rank these as much as possible, but of course, you know, when you're talking about your favorite books that you've read during a year, even the ones at the bottom of the list are fantastic, and some of the rankings are pretty arbitrary, especially when we get to the top like 4 or so take that as you will. Without further ado, let's just jump into my absolute favorite books that I read this year. Coming in at number 11 is the only picture book on this list, and that is Swan, The Life and Dance of Anna Pavlova by Norrell Snyder, illustrated by Julie Morstad. Now this was a book I picked up because I was planning on giving it to somebody as a gift, and I thought I might as well read it to see if it was any good before I gave it to them, and this book was just such a beautiful surprise. As the title implies, it follows Anna Pavlova's birth and early life and her decision to become a ballerina and all of the hardships that she experienced along the way as she trained and eventually became probably the most famous ballet dancer in history. And it's a really simple book, but it's so beautiful and evocative, and the illustrations are just gorgeous. Like, here's an example of one of them, and just reading this book is just... it's such an experience. I mean, this is a picture book, so I finished it in far less than 10 minutes, but I was crying at the end of it because it was just so emotional and personal. And you could really tell that the author and illustrator had a deep personal connection with Anna Pavlova's story. And I think this is a phenomenal book. I think it's great for younger readers, you know, since it's a picture book. I think it's great for any age, though, really. If you are at all interested in ballet or in Anna Pavlova's life, or even just reading something that is completely different from what you normally pick up, I think this is an amazing book. Next on my list is Above Us Only Sky by Michelle Youngstone. I've talked about this book on my channel before, and it is a magical realism kind of family drama, which, as I've said, are two things that are generally turn-offs for me in books, but I think the author of this one does such a fantastic job of integrating those two things, and you really grow to love and care about every single family member that you follow, which I think is one of the problems I tend to have with family dramas, is that inevitably there's one character I'm much more interested in than the others, so I don't really care about a majority of the book. But this book is so beautifully written. There's so much pain and suffering in this book, but there are also just really beautiful moments of humanity and compassion, and it also talks about a time in history that I don't think is covered very often, and that is the terrible things that Hitler and Stalin inflicted on the country and people of Lithuania. And of course World War II is talked about a lot, as it should be, but Lithuania's suffering during that time is not something I really learned about in school, and I think this is a fantastic exploration of that. And on top of that, it's also just a really great story. Like, you are so attached to these characters, and I just really, really love this book, and I highly recommend it. Personally, I think it does some of the things that The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender did for other people, but I think it does them a lot better. Number 9 on my list is The Homeward Bounders by Diana Wynne Jones. This is one of the books that I think you benefit from not knowing too much about it going into, which is, I know, a very irritating thing to hear from somebody reviewing a book. But I'm just going to say that it's sort of a science fiction slash fantasy. I don't really know how I would categorize it, but essentially the world is a tabletop game, and all of the humans on it are actually pieces that are being used by another kind of being that don't care about human lives at all. And it's such a fascinating premise, and I think the world building and plot work together so well to create this really unique story. This is a really short book. I think it's less than 300 pages, and it has one of my favorite, I guess you could say, tropes, in that the main character is sort of the opposite of the chosen one. He's just an ordinary kid who realizes that he is the one who's gonna have to step up and do things because nobody else is doing their job. Number 8 on my list is Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. You've probably seen this on a lot of favorite book lists already, so I'm going to be as brief as possible. Basically, we're following children who are sent and taken to these magical worlds like Narnia or the Looking Glass world or whatever, and then they get sent back to our world and they can't really adjust to normal life anymore. And so we're following a group of those characters as they're at like a special school to kind of get them back to ordinary life. and there's a lot of other things that go on, but I'm just gonna highlight some of the things that I loved about this book. It has amazing representation, which I know a lot of people have talked about. The writing style is really perfectly suited to this story. Like, it's very, I think, haunting and eerie at times, and the characters are just fantastic, and the whole premise is just so fascinating and I think well handled, and this is again a very, very short book, but it really packs a punch for me. Number 7 on my list is a new release, and that is Defy the Stars by Claudia Gray. I have hardly heard anyone talk about this book, even though it came out earlier this year, but this is a science fiction story that is really character driven, which I think is one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much. And one of the characters that we follow is sort of an android, I guess you would call him, and he's so advanced to the point where some people are questioning if he's actually a person or not. And one of those people is the other main character, Noemi Vidal. She is on the opposite side of this interstellar war. And I just love these characters so much. The plot is also really exciting and fast-paced, but the characters are just what make it for me, and the interactions they have with each other and with other characters. And I think stories like this, it's very easy to make that opposite sides of a war thing like really cheesy and forced, and I think Claudia Gray didn't do that at all. I flew through this book. I stayed up till I think 4 a.m. finishing this novel, and I feel like that's something I haven't done in a while, and this is just such a fantastic book. Again, it made me cry multiple times, and I'm realizing that a lot of the books on this list are ones that made me cry. So that's when you know it's good. Number 6 on my list is Hunted by Megan Spooner. This is a Beauty and the Beast fairy tale retelling, and it's one of the best ones I've ever read, and I love retellings, so I read a lot of them. And this is just so beautifully written, and I think the fact that it sticks very closely to the original story is actually one of the book's strengths, because Megan Spooner isn't afraid to use those older elements or like beats of that story, but she also puts her own twist on it, and I think that she just balances those two things really well, which is I think one of the tricky things about writing retellings. This is just one of the perfect atmospheric winter books, and I love it so much. I really wish more people were talking about it, because I haven't heard that much buzz about it even when it came out like months and months ago. So I highly recommend picking this up if you enjoy fairy tale retellings, or even if you don't. I think that this book has enough going for it in terms of writing and characters and plot that you could still enjoy it, because there's also elements of Russian folklore in here that are just fantastic. Okay guys, getting into the nitty-gritty of the top 4. Again, these ones, I sort of ranked them, but they're all basically number 1. The next one on my list is Drown by Esther Dalseno. This is another fairy tale retelling, and this is actually a retelling of The Little Mermaid, as you can probably tell. And this is another very short book that I think really has an impact despite its short length, and this is just one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking stories I've read this year. The race of mermaids in this book are absolutely not like the ones in the Disney movie. They're very inhuman and they don't experience emotions in the same way. So then when you follow the main character, who is actually never named in the story, and you start to see her grow and change and experience feelings and start to wonder things, it really affects you, I think, more deeply than it would in another kind of story. And just all of the character relationships in this are just so fantastic. And one of the things I loved about this book is that it makes it really hard for you to make up your mind about characters, because there are several who when I first started reading the book, I knew they were my least favorite. I didn't like you. There's no reason for you to be in the book. And then by the end, I was so invested in what happened to them, and I was hoping that they got their happy ending. And this is not a happily ever after type of story necessarily, but it's so worth the read, and it's just so beautiful, and I highly recommend it. Number 3 on my list is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I have not shut up about this book since I read it for Tome Topple, so I'm gonna keep it really brief and link my full review down below in case you're interested. But I love this book. It's like 1,000 pages, but it was such a quick read because I was enjoying it so much. The writing style and the characters and the author's take on fairies and how they intermingled with this alternate England's history are just so fantastic, and I enjoyed this book all the way through, and I was never bored, which is pretty impressive considering how long it is and the fact that it could have easily become a dense sort of drag, and it just never was. Number 2 on my list is Fly By Night by Frances Hardinge, and Frances Hardinge is one of my all-time favorite authors. I recently did a whole video on her, which I will again link down below. So it's no surprise that her book I read this year, which is not a new release, was at the top of my list. I just love this book. She has such a way of creating unique story concepts, and her characters are always just so nuanced and well developed, and I absolutely love her writing style. It's the perfect mix of like whimsical and practical, I guess you could say. I never feel like she overdoes it on how flowery the writing is, and I just love her books. If you haven't picked up one of this author's novels yet, I would highly recommend just giving one a try, seeing which summary sounds like you might be interested in it, and just picking it up, because I have loved every single one of her books. They've all been 5 stars for me, and they've all been favorites for me, and I just love this one so much. And there's actually a sequel that I'm looking forward to reading in the future. And finally, number 1 on my list is The Princess Curse by Mary Haskell. This was another huge surprise for me, because I did see Misty from The Book Rat recommend this book, and we tend to have similar tastes in fantasy books, but I was still blown away by how much I loved this novel. It's sort of a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses, but I kind of forget that sometimes because it's really not held back by that story. But I love this book so much. I'm planning on rereading it really soon because of how much I love it. And it's just so magical, and I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it because I love it so much, and I don't want to give away too many of the plot details because I think those are really fun to discover as you read. But the characters are great. I feel like the writing style is really, really enjoyable, and just I loved everything about this book. Everything in this book just sort of clicked for me, and I feel like this is a perfect rainy day, cozy kind of book, even though some of it gets a little darker than you're expecting. And don't be fooled by the cover, which, not that this cover is bad, but I think the book definitely has more depth and nuance than the cover suggests. Okay everybody, so those are my top 11 books that I have read this year. There's some really fantastic books this year, so I would love to hear if you guys have read any of these, what you thought of them. And I don't know if I'm going to do a like worst books of 2017 video, because I feel like the ones that I really hated, I've already complained about quite a bit on my channel, like I've already gotten it out there. So I don't know, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you soon with another one, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!